Picture this. It's the year 268 AD, and the Roman Empire is dying. Not the slow, dignified decline you might imagine, but a violent, chaotic implosion happening from every direction simultaneously. The empire that once seemed invincible, that had conquered everything from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria, is now being torn apart by enemies both foreign and domestic. And honestly, if you were a Roman citizen living through this nightmare, you'd probably think the end times had arrived. Let me paint you a picture of just how bad things had gotten. In the east, the Persian Sassanid Empire had just humiliated Rome in the worst way possible. They didn't just defeat a Roman army, they captured a Roman emperor. Emperor Valerian, the ruler of the known world, was taken prisoner by the Persian king Shapur I, and the stories of what happened to him are absolutely brutal. Some sources say Shapur used him as a human footstool, literally stepping on the back of a Roman emperor to mount his horse. When Valerian finally died in captivity, legend has it that Shapur had his skin flayed from his body, dyed red, and put on display in a Persian temple as a trophy. Whether that's entirely true or not, the fact that such stories circulated tells you everything about how low Roman prestige had fallen. But the Persians weren't the only problem. In the West, a breakaway Roman general named Postumus had declared himself emperor of what he called the Gallic Empire, taking control of Gaul, Britain, and Spain. So now Rome didn't even control its own western provinces. The empire was literally splitting apart. And then there were the Germanic tribes. For centuries, Rome had managed to keep the various Germanic peoples beyond the Rhine and Danube rivers more or less in check through a combination of military force, diplomacy, and playing them against each other. But by the mid-3rd century, something had changed. These tribes were organizing, forming larger confederations, and they were hungry. They'd seen Rome's weakness, and they smelled blood in the water. The Alemanni were raiding into Italy itself, the Franks were devastating Gaul, and in the Balkans and Greece, a massive coalition of Gothic tribes had been wreaking absolute havoc for years. They'd been raiding, pillaging, and burning their way through some of the wealthiest provinces of the empire. Athens, the birthplace of democracy, the crown jewel of classical civilization, had been sacked by the Goths. Let that sink in for a moment. The city of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, overrun by warriors from beyond the frontier. But here's where it gets even worse. These weren't just quick raiding parties anymore. By 268, the Goths had assembled what ancient sources describe as an absolutely staggering force. We're talking about somewhere between 300,000 to 320,000 people on the move. Now, not all of these were warriors. This was an entire migration, with women, children, and elderly following the fighting men. But even if only a third of them were actual combatants, you're still looking at over 100,000 Gothic warriors moving as a unified force. For context, that's larger than any army the Roman Empire could field at this point. The Goths had learned from their earlier raids. They'd figured out that the real wealth of the empire wasn't along the fortified frontiers, it was in the interior provinces that had grown fat and lazy from centuries of peace. So they'd built a fleet, sailed across the Black Sea, and started systematically plundering the rich coastal cities of Asia Minor and Greece. Cities that hadn't seen war in generations were suddenly being put to the torch. Temples that had stood for centuries were being stripped of their treasures, and the Roman military seemed powerless to stop it. This is the world that Emperor Claudius Gothicus inherited when he became emperor in 268. And let me tell you about this man, because Claudius is one of history's forgotten badasses. He wasn't some pampered aristocrat who bought his way to power. He was a career military man, a soldier's soldier who had risen through the ranks on pure merit. He'd commanded legions on the Danube frontier, the empire's most dangerous and demanding posting, where officers either became hard as iron or ended up dead. Claudius was the former, when he took power after the death of Emperor Gallienus, who was assassinated by his own officers. Claudius knew exactly what needed to be done. The empire was bleeding from 1,000 cuts, but if he didn't stop the Gothic invasion, nothing else would matter. The Goths had to be destroyed, not defeated, not turned back, but utterly annihilated to the point where they'd never dare threaten Rome again. Now the Goths had just wrapped up another successful raiding season in Greece and the Aegean. Their ships were loaded with plunder, their warriors were confident, and they were heading back north through the Balkans toward their homelands beyond the Danube. They probably figured the new emperor would be too busy consolidating power and dealing with all the other crises to come after them. They were wrong. Claudius moved with a speed that caught everyone off guard. He gathered every available unit he could scrape together, legions that were under strength and exhausted from years of constant warfare, auxiliary units from across the empire, cavalry detachments. He even incorporated units that had previously served under Gallienus, men who technically could have been considered his enemies, but Claudius understood that personal grudges were a luxury the empire couldn't afford. He needed every sword, every spear, every man who could fight. The ancient sources give us different numbers for Claudius's army, but modern historians generally estimate he assembled somewhere between 40,000 to 50,000 men, against a Gothic force that likely numbered over 100,000 warriors, plus all their non-combatants. On paper, this should have been a disaster waiting to happen. But Claudius had something the Goths didn't: a professional army, even one that was battered and worn down, operating with Roman discipline and tactical sophistication against a massive but less organized tribal confederation. And he had a plan. The Goths were moving north through the Balkans, following the ancient road system that connected Greece to the Danube frontier. Claudius studied the terrain, consulted with officers who knew the region, and identified the perfect place to trap them. Near the city of Naissus, modern-day Niš in Serbia, the valley narrowed. The terrain favored a defender who could control the high ground and channel the enemy's movement. Claudius force-marched his army to reach Naissus ahead of the Gothic horde. When his troops arrived, exhausted from the rapid march, he didn't let them rest. Instead, he had them immediately begin preparing the battlefield. They dug field fortifications. They positioned artillery. They scouted the surrounding terrain for every tactical advantage. The legionaries, veterans who'd been fighting for years, knew exactly what was at stake. This wasn't just another battle. This was the battle that would determine whether the empire survived or fell. When the Gothic host appeared on the horizon, it must have been a sight that struck fear into even the most battle-hardened Roman veterans. Ancient historians describe the sheer size of the Gothic force as being like a nation on the move. The warriors at the front, confident from years of successful raids. Behind them, wagons loaded with plunder from across the empire, women and children, herds of cattle and sheep. This wasn't just an army. It was an entire people who'd grown rich off Roman weakness. The Gothic leaders, men whose names history has largely forgotten, likely looked at Claudius's army blocking their path and figured this would be just another victory to add to their list. They'd beaten Roman armies before. They'd sacked some of the greatest cities in the empire. Why should this be any different? What happened next would become the stuff of legend. Claudius, demonstrating the tactical genius that would earn him his title, didn't immediately commit to a full-scale engagement. Instead, he used a portion of his cavalry to harass the Gothic column, picking at their flanks, drawing them forward, making them angry and impatient. The Goths, seeing what they thought was a smaller Roman force, took the bait. The first clash was brutal but inconclusive. The Romans gave ground, slowly, methodically, drawing the Goths deeper into the killing zone Claudius had prepared. To the Gothic warriors, it probably looked like the Romans were on the verge of breaking, just like so many Roman armies before them. They pressed forward harder, eager to crush this imperial force and continue their journey home with their plunder intact. This is where Claudius sprang his trap. The main body of his army, which had been concealed and held in reserve, suddenly appeared on the Gothic flanks. At the same time, the Roman forces that had been retreating suddenly stopped, turned and reformed their lines with the discipline that made the legions famous. In an instant, the Goths found themselves surrounded on three sides, pushed back against the terrain that now worked against them. The fighting that erupted was absolutely savage. We're talking about close-quarters combat on a scale that's hard to even imagine today. Tens of thousands of men, packed together, hacking at each other with swords, spears, and axes. The noise alone must have been deafening. The screams of wounded and dying men, the clash of metal on metal, officers shouting orders that could barely be heard over the din of battle. The Goths were fierce warriors. They had every reason to fight with desperate courage. Behind them were their families, their plunder, everything they'd gained from years of raiding. There was no retreat, no escape route. They had to break through the Roman lines or die trying. And they tried. God, how they tried. Wave after wave of Gothic warriors threw themselves at the Roman formations, trying to punch through by sheer weight of numbers and raw ferocity. But the Romans held. The legionaries, standing shoulder to shoulder behind their large rectangular shields, fought with the grim determination of men who knew they were fighting for the survival of everything they knew. Every meter of ground was paid for in blood. The line would buckle, would bend, but it wouldn't break. When gaps opened in the formation, reserves were immediately pushed forward to plug them. When units became exhausted from the strain of continuous combat, they were rotated out and fresh troops took their place. This was Roman military doctrine, operating exactly as it was designed to, and it was terrifyingly effective. As the first day of fighting drew to a close, the battlefield was already carpeted with the dead and dying. Ancient sources tell us that the Romans had inflicted horrendous casualties on the Goths, but they'd paid a heavy price themselves. Claudius's army was exhausted, bloodied, but they held their positions. The Goths, meanwhile, were trapped. They couldn't advance through the Roman lines, and they couldn't easily retreat with their entire population train following behind them. That night, the Roman camp was a scene of organized chaos. Wounded men being treated by field medics, officers assessing casualties and reorganizing units, soldiers checking their equipment, sharpening weapons, trying to grab whatever rest they could before the fighting resumed at dawn. Claudius moved through the camp, and this detail comes down to us from the ancient sources, personally speaking to his men, praising their courage, reminding them of what they were fighting for. This wasn't some distant figure commanding from a tent miles away. This was a general who understood that morale could be as important as tactics. Meanwhile, in the Gothic camp, there must have been a growing sense of dread. They'd expected an easy victory, or at worst, to be able to break through and continue north. Instead, they were trapped, and they'd lost thousands of warriors in a single day of fighting. The Gothic leaders faced an impossible choice: try to break through the Roman lines again, attempt a fighting retreat and abandon their non-combatants and plunder, or seek some kind of negotiated settlement. When dawn broke on the second day, the Goths chose to fight. They reorganized their forces and launched another massive assault on the Roman positions. If anything, the fighting on the second day was even more intense than the first. The Goths were now fighting with the desperation of men who understood they might not survive this. They threw everything they had at the Roman lines. The ancient historian Jordanes, writing about this battle, describes rivers running red with blood. Now, obviously that's hyperbole, the kind of dramatic language ancient historians love to use, but it speaks to just how catastrophic the casualties were becoming. We're talking about fighting that continued hour after hour, with brief pauses for both sides to catch their breath before plunging back into the slaughter. Claudius, seeing that his infantry were bearing the brunt of the Gothic assault, made a crucial tactical decision. He ordered his cavalry, which he'd been holding in reserve, to sweep around and attack the Gothic camp from behind. This wasn't just a military target. This was where the Goths had left their families, their plunder, everything they valued. Roman cavalry thundered into the camp, setting tents ablaze, scattering herds, creating absolute chaos. When word of the attack on their camp reached the Gothic warriors on the front lines, the psychological impact was devastating. Suddenly they weren't just fighting to break through, they were fighting to save their families. The Gothic formation, which had been holding together through sheer desperation, began to fragment as warriors broke off to rush back to defend the camp. This is exactly what Claudius had been waiting for. The moment the Gothic line wavered, the Roman infantry surged forward. The professional discipline that had kept them in tight formations all day now gave them an enormous advantage. While the Goths were scattered and confused, trying to deal with threats from multiple directions, the Romans advanced in organized units, methodically cutting down anyone in their path. What followed was a massacre. The ancient sources describe Gothic warriors being cut down by the thousands as they tried to flee. The cavalry, having devastated the camp, wheeled around and began pursuing fleeing warriors, running them down in the open field. Small groups of Goths tried to form defensive positions to protect their families, but isolated and surrounded, they were systematically destroyed. By the end of the second day, the Gothic force that had seemed so unstoppable just days before was shattered. But the battle wasn't over. A large portion of the Gothic host, maybe 50,000 people or more, managed to break away from the main battlefield and retreated toward a fortified position in the hills. They were bloodied, they'd lost most of their plunder, and thousands of their warriors were dead, but they were still a formidable force. Claudius could have declared victory and let them go. His army was exhausted, he'd already inflicted a devastating defeat, but he knew that if he let this Gothic force escape, they'd regroup, they'd rebuild, and in a few years they'd be back raiding the empire again. This had to end here, at Naissus, once and for all. The third phase of the battle became a siege. The Goths had fortified their position and dug in. They still had some supplies, and they were willing to fight to the death to protect what remained of their people. Claudius surrounded their position and settled in for what became a grinding war of attrition. Roman artillery pounded the Gothic fortifications. Small units probed for weaknesses. Supplies were cut off. Inside the Gothic position, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Overcrowding, lack of clean water, and the presence of thousands of rotting corpses from the earlier fighting created perfect conditions for disease. Plague broke out. Not just any plague, but a devastating epidemic that began killing Goths by the hundreds, then thousands. The same plague would eventually spread to the Roman army and throughout the empire, but in that enclosed Gothic position, it was absolutely catastrophic. Gothic warriors who had survived the battle started dying from disease. Children, elderly, the wounded, they all succumbed. The sources tell us that the stench of death became so overwhelming that Roman soldiers refused to approach the position even when the Goths tried to surrender. The Goths attempted breakout after breakout, small groups trying to fight their way through the Roman siege lines. Most were cut down. Those who did escape were hunted through the surrounding countryside by Roman cavalry. The siege lasted for weeks, possibly months. The exact timeline is unclear because our ancient sources are frustratingly vague on this point. But what's clear is that by the time it ended, the Gothic force that had numbered over 300,000 people had been reduced to a fraction of that. Tens of thousands, possibly over 100,000, lay dead on the battlefield, in the siege camp, or scattered throughout the surrounding region. The few Gothic survivors who were captured were enslaved or pressed into Roman military service. The plunder they'd accumulated from years of raiding was recovered and either returned to its rightful owners or claimed by the Roman state. The Gothic threat to the empire, which had seemed so insurmountable just months before, had been utterly eliminated. Now let me tell you why this battle mattered so much. The Battle of Naissus didn't just stop one Gothic invasion, it fundamentally changed the trajectory of the entire empire. Before Naissus, Rome was in a death spiral. Every defeat emboldened more enemies. Every loss of territory made the empire weaker and less able to defend what remained. Rome was being dragged down into chaos, and it looked like nothing could stop it. Naissus reversed that momentum. Suddenly, Rome had demonstrated that it could still win, and win decisively. The victory didn't solve the empire's problems, not even close, but it bought time. It showed that the empire wasn't finished yet, that there were still leaders capable of strategic brilliance and armies capable of legendary victories. Emperor Claudius Gothicus, the man who orchestrated this victory, earned his surname from this battle. Gothicus, conqueror of the Goths, he became a legend in his own time. Unfortunately, he didn't get to enjoy his triumph for long. Remember that plague I mentioned? The one that swept through the Gothic camp? It spread to the Roman army, and Claudius himself contracted it. In 270 AD, just 2 years after his great victory, Emperor Claudius Gothicus died of the plague. He was only 56 years old, but his legacy lived on. The victory at Naissus had given the empire breathing room, and the generals who came after him, particularly Aurelian, used that breathing room to continue the work of restoration. Aurelian would go on to reunite the empire, bringing the Gallic Empire back into the fold, defeating the Palmyrene Empire in the east, and earning his own legendary status as Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. Here's something fascinating that historians debate to this day. What if Claudius had lost at Naissus? What if those 100,000 Gothic warriors had smashed through his lines and continued their rampage through the empire? The Gothic tribes would have been emboldened beyond measure. Other Germanic peoples would have seen that Rome was truly defenseless. The empire might have collapsed right then and there, in the 26 O's and 270 seconds, instead of limping along for another 2 centuries in the west and over 1,000 years in the east. Western civilization, as we know it, might have developed completely differently. The Christian Church, which was still in its early stages, might never have had the Roman Empire as its vehicle for spreading across Europe. The legal systems, the administrative structures, the cultural achievements that Rome bequeathed to the medieval world and ultimately to us, all of that might have been lost or fundamentally altered. Think about it. The Renaissance was built on the rediscovery of Roman and Greek texts. The Enlightenment thinkers drew heavily on Roman law and political philosophy. The founders of the United States consciously modeled aspects of American government on the Roman Republic. All of that traces back through a chain of cultural transmission that required the Roman Empire to survive long enough to pass its knowledge on to successor civilizations. And that chain could have been broken at Naissus in 268 AD if not for the tactical genius of an emperor most people have never heard of and the courage of an exhausted Roman army that refused to break. But let's zoom back in on the battle itself, because there are some incredible details I haven't mentioned yet. The ancient sources tell us that the battlefield at Naissus was so littered with corpses that it took months to clear them all. Local farmers reportedly found bones and armor fragments for generations afterward. Some modern archaeological surveys in the region have found what might be mass graves from this period, though confirming they're specifically from Naissus is difficult, given how much the area has changed over 1,700 years. The psychological impact on both sides was enormous. For the Goths and other Germani, sea tribes, Naissus became a cautionary tale. For decades afterward, Gothic mothers reportedly used the battle as a threat to scare their children into behaving. The name Claudius became synonymous with Roman military might restored. Germanic tribes that had been planning their own raids suddenly thought twice about it. For the Romans, Naissus was a desperately needed morale boost. Citizens in cities across the empire, who'd been living in fear of barbarian attack, suddenly dared to hope again. The army, which had suffered defeat after defeat, remembered what it felt like to win a decisive victory. Recruitment, which had been a major problem as people avoided military service during the crisis years, became easier as the prestige of serving in the legions was partially restored. The battle also demonstrated something crucial about Roman military tactics that sometimes gets overlooked. The legion system, which dated back centuries, was incredibly flexible and adaptable. At Naissus, we see Claudius using a combination of infantry, cavalry, siege warfare, and psychological tactics. He didn't just rely on one approach. He adapted to the situation, used the terrain, exploited enemy weaknesses, and maintained discipline even when things got chaotic. This adaptability was a key Roman advantage throughout their history. While other ancient powers might have superior cavalry or fiercer individual warriors, the Romans excelled at combined arms warfare and maintaining cohesion even in the most desperate situations. Naissus is a textbook example of these principles in action. Now, I mentioned earlier that our sources for this battle are frustratingly incomplete, and I want to be honest with you about that. The main ancient accounts come from writers like Zosimus, Jordanus, and the Historia Augusta, and all of them have problems. They were written well after the events, sometimes centuries later. They often contradict each other on details like numbers, dates, and sequences of events. Some historians suspect they exaggerated the size of the Gothic force to make Claudius's victory seem even more impressive. Modern historians have to piece together what actually happened by comparing these flawed ancient sources, looking at archaeological evidence, studying the terrain, and making educated guesses based on what we know about Roman and Gothic military practices of the period. So when I give you numbers like 300,000 Goths or 50,000 Romans, understand that these are estimates, probably on the high end, and the real numbers might have been considerably smaller. But even if we cut those numbers in half, we're still talking about one of the largest and most significant battles of the 3rd century, with casualties that would have been staggering by any measure. The core facts remain undisputed. There was a massive Gothic invasion. Claudius Gothicus intercepted and destroyed them at Naissus. The victory was decisive enough to stop Gothic raiding for a generation. And the empire survived. You know what's really tragic? For all its importance, Naissus is barely remembered today outside of specialist historical circles. Most history classes skip right over it. Popular culture obsesses over battles like Cannae or the Teutoburg Forest, but Naissus, which arguably had far greater long-term consequences, is forgotten. Part of this is because it happened during the crisis of the 3rd century, a period that generally gets glossed over in the narrative between the height of the empire under the Antonines and the reforms of Diocletian and Constantine. But I'd argue that the crisis of the 3rd century, and specifically moments like Naissus, are actually more interesting and more important than the more famous periods. This was Rome at its most vulnerable, its most desperate, and yet somehow it survived. That survival required extraordinary leadership, incredible sacrifice, and moments of brilliance like Claudius's victory at Naissus. The soldiers who fought at Naissus, the men who held the line against overwhelming odds, who fought for 3 days straight in some of the most brutal conditions imaginable, they saved civilization. And most of them were just ordinary men, farmers and craftsmen who'd been conscripted into the legions, career soldiers looking forward to retirement, men from all across the empire speaking different languages, worshipping different gods, but united under the Roman eagles. They were outnumbered, exhausted, facing an enemy that had been winning for years. And they won anyway. They won because their emperor refused to give up. They won because Roman military training and discipline was still, even in the empire's darkest hour, superior to anything their enemies could muster. And they won because the alternative, the total collapse of their civilization, was simply unacceptable. Think about the individual moments of courage that must have occurred during those 3 days. The centurion who held his section of the line together when it seemed about to break. The common soldier who dragged a wounded comrade to safety under fire. The cavalry trooper who charged into overwhelming numbers to buy time for his unit to retreat. The engineer who kept the artillery functioning despite exhaustion and danger. All of these individual acts of courage and duty, multiplied by tens of thousands of participants, created the victory that saved the empire. After Naissus, the Roman Empire still had over 2 centuries to go in the west, and would continue in the east as the Byzantine Empire for another 1,200 years. During that time, it would give the world codified law, preserved classical knowledge, spread Christianity, and create art and architecture that still inspires us today. None of that happens if Claudius loses at Naissus. The entire trajectory of Western history pivots on those 3 days of fighting in a valley in the Balkans. And here's the kicker. Claudius himself probably understood the significance of what he'd achieved. The sources tell us that after the battle he was hailed as the savior of the empire. He'd proven that Rome could still defend itself, that the legions could still fight and win, that there were still leaders worthy of the purple imperial robes. But he also knew the job wasn't finished. There were still threats on every border. The Alemanni still needed to be dealt with. The breakaway empires still needed to be brought back into the fold. The administrative and economic problems that had contributed to the crisis still needed addressing. Claudius had bought the empire time, but time alone wouldn't be enough. It would take sustained effort over decades to truly stabilize the situation. And tragically, he didn't live to see that work through to completion. The plague that killed him was probably contracted during or shortly after the siege of the Gothic position at Naissus. In a very real sense, the battle claimed his life even though he survived the fighting itself. There's a monument in modern Naissus, on the approximate site of ancient Naissus, that commemorates the battle. It's not particularly well known, even to many history enthusiasts, but if you ever find yourself in Serbia, I'd encourage you to visit it. Stand there and imagine what happened on that ground 1750 to 6 years ago. Imagine the clash of armies, the courage and the carnage. The turning point that saved an empire, the Battle of Naissus, deserves to be remembered alongside the most famous battles in history. It was the moment when the Roman Empire, bleeding from 1,000 wounds, on the verge of total collapse, turned and bared its teeth one more time. It was the moment when a forgotten emperor named Claudius demonstrated that brilliant leadership still mattered. It was the moment when the legions proved they could still fight like the legends of old. And it was the moment that bought Western civilization the time it needed to survive its darkest hour. So the next time someone tells you that Rome fell because it grew weak and decadent, because the legions were no longer capable of defending the empire, because there were no more great leaders, remember Naissus. Remember that in 268 AD, when things were at their absolute worst, Rome found the strength to win the most important victory of the 3rd century. Remember Emperor Claudius Gothicus, who history has largely forgotten, but who deserves to be counted among the greatest Roman military commanders. And remember those tens of thousands of Roman soldiers whose names we'll never know, who stood their ground against impossible odds and changed the course of history. The Battle of Naissus was the slaughter that saved the Roman Empire, and through saving the empire, it saved so much more. The cultural, legal, and intellectual legacy of Rome that would shape Europe and the world for centuries to come, all of it survived because of 3 days of desperate fighting in a valley in the Balkans. That's the power of a single battle. That's why history matters. And that's why we should never forget Naissus. You know what really gets me about this battle? It's not just the scale or the bloodshed or even the world historical importance. It's the fact that we almost lost all knowledge of it entirely. See, the 3rd century was such a chaotic mess that record-keeping basically fell apart. The imperial bureaucracy that normally documented everything was struggling just to keep basic government functions running. Scribes who should have been recording history for posterity were instead dealing with hyperinflation, plague, and constant political upheaval. So much from this period was simply lost or survived only in fragmentary form. The accounts we do have of Naissus were written generations, or even centuries later, by historians who were working from sources that no longer exist. They were piecing together stories passed down through military tradition, probably exaggerated with each retelling, mixed with whatever official records happened to survive. It's honestly a miracle we know about the battle at all, and that makes you wonder, how many other crucial moments from this period are we completely unaware of, because the records just didn't survive? But let's talk about something else that fascinates me: the Gothic perspective. We know so much about this battle from the Roman side, but what about the Goths themselves? They didn't have a written literary tradition at this point, so we have almost nothing from their point of view. But imagine being a Gothic warrior at Naissus. You've spent years raiding the richest empire in the world. You've seen Athens. You've plundered cities that your ancestors could never have imagined existed. You're heading home with more wealth than your tribe has ever possessed, and then suddenly, in a single catastrophic 3-day period, everything falls apart. Your entire world is destroyed. The majority of your people are dead. The plunder you risked your life for is gone. Your family might be enslaved or killed. The Gothic communities that survived Naissus must have been absolutely devastated, not just militarily but psychologically and culturally. Entire lineages were wiped out. Knowledge and traditions died with the people who carried them. The trauma must have echoed through Gothic society for generations. There's evidence that the Gothic peoples underwent significant social and political reorganization in the decades after Naissus. The old tribal structures that had led them into that disastrous battle were questioned. New leaders emerged, ones who had learned from the catastrophe and understood they needed different strategies for dealing with Rome. In a strange way, Naissus didn't just change Rome, it changed the Goths too, forcing them to evolve in ways that would eventually lead to their successful settlements within the empire in later centuries. This brings up an interesting counterfactual. What if the Goths had won at Naissus? Not just survived, but actually destroyed Claudius's army and killed the emperor? The immediate aftermath would have been catastrophic for Rome. With no army standing between them and the heart of the empire, the Goths could have potentially marched on Italy itself. Rome, the eternal city, hadn't been sacked by a foreign enemy in over 600 years, not since the Gauls under Brennus in 387 BC. That psychological barrier, the idea that Rome itself was inviolable, was a huge part of imperial propaganda and citizen morale. If Rome had fallen to the Goths in 269 or 270 AD, over a century before Alaric's famous sack of 410, the shock would have been even more devastating, because the empire was already so fragile. It's entirely possible that such a blow would have triggered complete disintegration. Provincial governors might have declared independence. The army might have fragmented into warlord factions. The monetary system, already in crisis, could have collapsed entirely. We might be looking at a timeline where the Roman Empire effectively ended in the late 3rd century, rather than limping along for another 2 centuries in the West. And what would have replaced it? Probably a patchwork of Germanic kingdoms, smaller regional powers, maybe some city-states modelled on the Greek polis. Would Christianity have still risen to dominance without the Roman state to adopt and spread it? Would classical learning have been preserved without the empire's libraries and schools? Would the concept of Europe as a unified civilization have ever developed? These are huge questions that all hinge on whether Claudius won or lost at Naissus. Let's also consider the personal impact on Claudius himself. Before Naissus, he was a respected general, but one among many. After Naissus, he was a legend. The ancient sources tell us that his soldiers practically worshipped him. He had achieved something that had seemed impossible, turning back the Gothic tide when everyone else had failed. That kind of victory doesn't just win you military prestige, it gives you political capital that's almost unlimited. If Claudius had lived longer, if the plague hadn't taken him, what might he have accomplished? Could he have reunited the breakaway provinces sooner? Might he have reformed the imperial succession system to prevent the constant civil wars? We'll never know, but it's tantalizing to think about. His early death meant that much of his work was left unfinished, but even in just 2 years as emperor, with Naissus as his crowning achievement, he did enough to earn his place among the great Roman leaders. There's also a military tactical lesson from Naissus that remained relevant for centuries afterward. Claudius demonstrated that even when badly outnumbered, a well-disciplined force with superior tactics and good use of terrain could defeat a much larger enemy. This wasn't a new idea in Roman military thinking, but Naissus provided a textbook example of these principles in action at massive scale. Later Roman military manuals, like the Strategikon written centuries later under the Byzantine Empire, would reference battles like Naissus as examples of proper generalship. The idea of using terrain to channel enemy movement, of refusing to be drawn into a disadvantageous engagement, of maintaining reserve forces to exploit opportunities. These all sound obvious in hindsight, but required enormous discipline to execute under the stress of actual combat. Claudius's army, remember, was exhausted from a forced march. They were probably under strength and undersupplied. Many of the soldiers had been fighting for years in other campaigns. They had every reason to be demoralized, yet they performed brilliantly because their leadership was sound and their training was solid. This points to something important about Roman military success that sometimes gets overlooked in favor of more dramatic factors. Yes, Roman technology was good. Yes, Roman logistics were impressive. But fundamentally, Rome won battles because of institutional knowledge. The legion system had been refined over centuries. Every centurion had been trained by someone who'd been trained by someone who'd been trained by someone, going back generations. This accumulated wisdom, this organizational memory, was Rome's secret weapon. Even when the empire was falling apart, even when everything else was going wrong, the army still remembered how to fight. Of course, that institutional knowledge was slowly being lost during the 3rd century crisis. Constant warfare meant experienced officers were being killed faster than they could train replacements. Budget crises meant training standards were slipping. Recruitment problems meant the army was increasingly filled with foreign auxiliaries who didn't have the same connection to Roman military tradition. Naissus was, in some ways, one of the last great displays of the old legion system operating at its peak. The armies that would eventually evolve into the late Roman and Byzantine military would be quite different, more cavalry-focused, more reliant on federated barbarian troops, more defensive in orientation. But in 268, at Naissus, we see the Roman legion system in all its brutal glory. Heavy infantry forming the backbone of the army, careful coordination between different unit types, sophisticated use of reserves and tactical flexibility, engineering and logistics enabling the siege phase of the battle. This was Rome fighting the way Rome had always fought, and proving that those old methods could still win. Let me tell you about one more aspect of this battle that I find absolutely fascinating. The plague that broke out during the siege wasn't just any disease. Modern historians have debated what exactly it was, but many think it might have been an early outbreak of what would later be called the Plague of Cyprian, a devastating pandemic that ravaged the Roman Empire throughout the 3rd century. Some scholars think it was smallpox or measles. Others argue for a hemorrhagic fever similar to Ebola. Whatever it was, it killed millions across the empire. The fact that this plague emerged during or immediately after Naissus, in a battlefield situation with thousands of corpses rotting in the summer heat, perfect conditions for disease, means that the battle itself might have been a major vector for spreading the pandemic more widely. Roman soldiers who survived the battle carried the disease back to their home provinces. Gothic survivors who escaped carried it to their communities beyond the frontier. In a twisted way, Naissus might have hurt both sides far more through disease than through direct combat casualties. This reminds us that in ancient warfare, disease was often a bigger killer than battle. Armies marching through unfamiliar territory, drinking contaminated water, living in unsanitary conditions, suffering from malnutrition, these were all recipe for epidemic. Modern estimates suggest that in most ancient and medieval military campaigns, for every soldier who died in combat, 3 or 4 died from disease. Naissus, with its unique combination of a massive 3-day battle followed by a weeks-long siege in close quarters, was probably a worst-case scenario for disease transmission. The fact that Claudius himself died from the plague he may have encountered at his greatest victory has a tragic irony to it. He saved the empire but couldn't save himself. It's the kind of detail that ancient historians loved because it fit their ideas about fate and the gods bringing down even the mightiest heroes. Whether you believe in that or not, you have to admit there's something poignant about it. So where does all this leave us? Standing here in 2026, Looking back across 17.5 centuries at a battle that changed everything, what are we supposed to take away from this? I think the lesson of Naissus is that history is never inevitable. At so many points things could have gone differently. If Claudius had been a less capable general, if the Roman army had broken and run, if the plague had hit Roman forces first instead of the besieged Goths, any of these changes could have led to a completely different outcome. The empire was saved not by some inexorable historical force, not by destiny or divine providence, but by human decisions and human courage, by an emperor who refused to accept defeat, by soldiers who stood their ground when running would have been easier, by officers who maintained discipline when everything was chaos. History is made by people, and the Battle of Naissus is a perfect example of how the actions of individuals, multiplied across an army of thousands, can literally change the world. Thank you for watching this deep dive into one of history's most important forgotten battles. If you